Hi, it's Dr. Scott Langford. Welcome to week 2 of our children's literature adventures, in which we're going to be changing lenses, and we're going to go from the idea of childhood in Victorian England to what's called post-colonial theory. And this, by the way, is probably the most popular, perhaps the most powerful, and certainly the most widespread of all the critical lenses that we'll be using. Something you've really just got to know to survive in universities worldwide these days. So you can thank me and thank these critics for introducing you to these wonderful theories. And what is post-colonial theory? Well, we can name names, of course, famous names. Edward Said, the great Palestinian British critic who wrote this book called Orientalism in the 1980s that changed and really founded the whole field. Omi Baba at Harvard, whose work is absolutely foundational. Just saw him speak at the MLA National Convention last January in Philadelphia. My own mentor and teacher at Stanford, Mary Pratt, whose idea of the contact zone is the one that I really want to introduce to you today. Because what this means is, yes, certainly there's a lot of oppression and repression in terms of how colonized peoples are treated, represented in Europeanized literatures, including American literature. You can see on the cover here, here's the colonial subject literally carrying the travel writer on his back. So it's not as if there's not oppression and repression. But what Professor Pratt's great point was that this is actually an interchange, right? That colonialized peoples were not silenced, that they talked back, pushed back, fought back, wrote their own literatures, responded in both English and their own original languages, their own indigenous languages, to all these ideas that were pouring in from outside. And those ideas came back in the other direction to Europe as well. So one way to think about what's happening this week, and it's actually quite fascinating, is to ask what happens when you take little Oliver, the orphan of London, in the 1830s, and you pick him up and you put him down in, let's say, the British Caribbean later on in the century, in the Victorian era. That's what Treasure Island essentially is. Newly orphaned kid suddenly finds himself surrounded by pirates in the middle of the Caribbean on this fictionalized island looking for treasure, etc., etc. That's the contact zone, all right? Now, another aspect of this is something called a Robinsonade, and that goes back to the book that I would assign if I had more weeks for you, called Robinson Crusoe, written in the 1700s, Daniel Defoe, and it sets up this story that gets told again and again and again and again, hence Robinsonade, in which the European seafarer or adventurer guy, always a guy, is marooned on some quote-unquote desert, as in deserted island somewhere, and there's a whole period of chaos, but at the end there's always kind of re-establishment of British values, as if to prove that if you put someone down in this Garden of Eden and he was British, the entire British Empire would sort of recrystallize itself by magic, which tends to indicate that the British thought that everything that they were doing was natural and necessary, and that they were the world's natural rulers. Well, doesn't that sound racist in retrospect? Yes, it does. And that's some of what was argued against Kipling, and to some degree Robert Louis Stevenson, for some time, right? So these authors are also quite controversial in that way. That's part of post-colonial criticism as well, all right? Now, the other part of this that I want to emphasize is that we're not going to be reading the whole book, so don't get scared off by the 3 novels. I will confess that I keep, honestly, trying not to reread these novels that I've read many times, and I completely failed with Treasure Island. So I've given you some chapters in Treasure Island. I decided to sort of focus mainly on the character of Long John Silver, from whom we get almost all the different pirate characters all the way up to Johnny Depp. I'll talk about that in the next video. But remember that I'm only asking you to read 3, 4, 5 chapters of that book. I myself was completely unable to do this, and I ended up reading the whole book compulsively, living with the pirates all week, and I'm a little bit afraid that the same thing is already happening with Kim. This happened in London also. These books are absolutely incredible. They're really hard to put down. So if possible, dive in, right? But if you can otherwise hang on, then just read the chapters assigned. I can't wait to hear what you have to write to me this week. Thank you very, very much. Looking forward to your journals, your discussions, and your essays.